and welcome back to Earthbeat Visions, a history of the future sound of London, and welcome to a video about the most confusing album release of all time, Amorphous Androgynous, the Isness, released on the 27th of July 2002. It's going to be a long one, and the only real way to cover it is chronologically. Strap yourselves in, cosmic lovers. You know, something that always bugs me? When you're watching an episode of something and it ends on a cliffhanger, and then the next episode it doesn't pick up straight where the cliffhanger left off but goes on a completely different tangent with a different part of the story. That kind of feels like what I've been doing here. The build up to the Isness and everything that came post Dead Cities was interrupted by all the 2001 releases. And it's finally time to pick up where the Monstrous Psychedelic Bubble Volume 1 left off. Actually, the story begins in late '96. By the time it came out, Dead Cities was almost 6 months old, and that's a long time for musicians who work as fast as Brian and Gaz do. By the time of the album's ISDN tour, they'd been in Dead Cities mode for 18 months and needed a change. Gaz in particular was beginning to crave something more immediately expressive in music. Before meeting Brian, he had been the frontman and songwriter in bands, and after many years of faceless electronica, he wanted to bring some of that back into his life. Indeed, there are hints of it on Dead Cities itself. The vocal introduction to Everyone in the World Is Doing Something Without Me had been picked from a full demo song called I Need Recalibrate. Gaz had recorded at his home studio. Dead Cities itself ends with Gaz singing, and that leads directly into his guitar playing on Her Face Forms in Summertime. The album also features forays into modern classical music. At this point it was simply a desire, and in interviews he was still very involved in the FSOL broadcast system. He spoke enthusiastically to GLR about multimedia, promising that in the new year, in fact, we're taking that one step further and we're going to be transmitting live to TV and radio. The desire for change may have come at least partially from the band spending more time outside of the studio, both in a positive and negative way. Gaz spent a lot of time in '95 being very hedonistic. In 2002 he would tell Echoes, I think Brian had gotten a little tired of seeing a very wasted sort of guy standing at the door, talking about how he'd taken loads of drugs and got laid and almost celebrating his success. But, having quit that lifestyle, had started to explore the world around him more and seemed in a better place mentally. There are worrying moments in 1994 interviews where being cooped up in Earthbeat seems to have been taking its toll on him, particularly this moment in an extensive Melody Maker article. The degree of control Brian and I exercise over our music and our lives is deeply unhealthy. There are lots of negatives, and I'm thinking very hard whether I want to carry on because this is making me really unhappy. We don't even achieve what we're trying to do. Where's it all going to end? Compare this to the interviews found on 1996 radio bootlegs, and he appears to have undergone a rapid transformation into someone far happier and healthier. The other key quote from 1994 would likely be, "Hopefully another side of me will come out one day, probably away from the techno bracket." I seem to get asked a lot of technology questions, which kind of sits ill at ease with me and what I'm like. While the idea of Gaz writing the tunes and Brian being the engineer is a bit of a generalisation, both of them seem to find some truth in it. The best tracks have elements of both of us though. I'm fairly melodic in the way that I work, and Brian is prepared to spend that extra time on the desk getting the sound right. And Gaz is good at writing tunes, but he doesn't choose his sounds properly, and I think that's what I'm good at, choosing sounds that work together, are both very telling quotes. So, desiring a change from this, he began to return to his roots, considering singing and playing guitar again. At the same time, he would also make reference to practicing meditation and attending hypnotherapy sessions, clearly in hope of getting his head straight. Around this time, he met Ian Astbury, having recently left the band he's best known for, The Cult. The pair bonded over a love of both songwriting and sonics, and this fed into the idea behind the new approach. Gaz and Ian came up with a list of 10 rules for the integration of the psychedelic song into electronic music, and called it the Mojo Filter. By this point it was becoming obvious that the next FSOL album was going to significantly feature vocals. Not inherently a strange thing, as it had happened before, and many of their peers included guest vocalists on their albums. We wanted a form of music which had lyrics but wasn't dependent on being catchy, and was more a 50-50 blend of sound sonic and enigmatic visual poetry. Together the three came up with a piece called The Shining Path, in the final 2 minutes featuring Astbury on vocals. This was broadcast on the band's ISDN transmission to BBC Radio 3's Mixing It programme in March '97. Eventually the track was considered too dark, unsurprising given that it was born out of the remains of We Are Explosive, but seen as a good starting point. At this point, Both Gaz and Brian had started expanding their musical tastes, picking up intriguing looking second-hand records in places such as Brick Lane, the music proving more surprising and a lot cheaper than the dance music that was found around at the time. A lot of this ended up as sample fodder, of course, and began to feed into the new music they were producing. Tracks like Exchanged, Poppadom and East Pacifica, and the untitled track that would eventually become Theram, heard on 1997's Peel Session and Fun radio broadcasts, continued this move into psychedelic rock-laden breakbeat. Eventually, much of this new listening matter was pieced together for the first monstrous psychedelic bubble exploding in your mind mix, initially considered for release by both Virgin and Mixmag, and eventually, and more realistically, broadcast to Manchester's Kiss 102. The purpose behind the show's conception was less obviously commercial. Gaz described it as being initially conceived as an internal document of intent, a bunch of tracks culled from the annals of time that for us represented the way forward. The blend of classical Indian instrumentation, psychedelic rock, folk, breakbeats, film scores, ambience and sampling was to be the template for what the fifth FSOL album would sound like. At the same time, Gaz's friendship with Ian Astbury resulted in him being invited to stop with Astbury in LA. The inner rock and roll kid inside Gaz was thrilled, and he took up the opportunity willingly. After a few days of hedonism, tourism and retail therapy, the shine began to wear off, however, and he took a trip to Colorado to an alternative religion and spirituality centre for a weekend of Zen meditation. Upon returning to LA, the experience feeling more sour after his meditation, he had numerous adventures. A trip to San Francisco with a stranger, spending a night with a homeless couple, getting his first tattoo, many of which were later recounted in the Ramblings of a Madman section of the official website. Eventually, tiring of the falseness of his surroundings, Gaz moved on. One way or another, he ended up in Mexico, and an underlying discomfort began to turn into illness. It was here that he found a doctor who introduced him to the controversial idea of mercury poisoning from fillings. Gaz dutifully got his removed and began to feel better. Having benefited from alternative medicine and religion, India typically beckoned, and there he began to study meditation and other spiritual practices, as well as write songs. Some of these he recorded to tape and sent back to London. At this point, Brian was beginning to worry. There's a wonderful bit in a Guardian interview from late 2001 in which he talks about it. I used to stand outside Gaz's house and wonder if he was in. Is he there? Where is he? Who the fuck is he anyway? No phone calls for weeks on end. No Gaz. Is he still my mate? Is he in England? Where the fuck is he now? He tracked Cobain's progress via his Visa card bills. He's reached his limit, he'll be back soon. Oh no, he's extended it. Brian was still heading to Dollis Hill to work on music, and of course both Leon Marr and Simon Wells, whose music had been released on the band's EPV label in 1997 and was generally considered an inspiration behind the new direction, were there to work with him. Earthbeat had recently been updated with new Macintosh computers, which Brian dutifully set about learning. This allowed for more integration of direct audio into their music, although Brian was the sole one learning these as Gaz was away. As Gaz's tapes arrived, Brian began to look into how to incorporate these elements into new material, learning recording techniques and trying out new software that could cope with longer, more detailed sessions. The earliest sessions at Earthbeat were typically DIY. Gaz describes a vocal booth adapted from the room with the sink into which Brian used to piss, but gradually newer kit was being collected. Brian told Overload Media how he envisioned these demos developing. My idea was to jam through the Gaz's songs and build them from his guitar with the samplers, two guys jamming with acoustics and electronics. Songs from these early sessions included Marylebone Road, The Peppermint Tree and Divinity, as well as instrumental, more typically FSOL sounding pieces like Guru Song, Elysian Fields and Tiny Space Birds. Eventually, Gaz returned to the UK. It having been months since they last saw each other, the original meetings began with awkward bike rides in the country. Having always been a city-based pair, the country was a new setting and Brian was initially uncertain. Gaz, on the other hand, had told Robotnik, maybe London is actually on the decline for me as a notion way back in '96. They would take Walkmans and portable speakers to play each other new bits of music they'd begun to work on. It was on one of these bike rides that Gaz jumped off a bale of hay and broke his leg, which proved to be a pivotal moment. As he stayed at home to recover, he picked up his guitar much more and pushed the new approach further, moving from song fragments into full pieces, such as the Galaxial Pharmaceutical. As he continued to write and practice his newfound love of yoga, meditation and such, he stayed at home for longer periods, even after his ankle had healed. At this point, Brian too had moved to Shoreditch, and it seemed as if the best way to get Gaz to come back to the studio was to bring the studio to Gaz. Earthbeat was abandoned in favour of a new studio space in Old Street, once home to the Shaman. It was dubbed the Galaxial Pharmaceutical and decked out in all the latest gear, including a live room. Brian calls me a traditional prick these days. An interview quote from 1996 there. There's a battle going on in the studio as we speak between the two of us, yeah. Maybe it's the only way to go actually. As is that. The pair are reticent about revealing details of the next FSOL album, but hint towards it being much more song-based structurally. That one's from 98, although took place in 97. By early 98 things had gone a lot further, and the songs and samplers idea went out of the window. Brian's feeling? Gaz on the other hand had more grandiose ideas which involved the full prog rinse, orchestras, drummers, bass players, sitar players, choirs, etc. This is effectively the point where the sessions stopped being part of the 5th FSOL album and started becoming the Isness. Gaz pretty much controlled the ship and guided the musical structures, with Brian feeding the engine and making sure everything ran smoothly and sounded correct. Ever the socialite, Gaz began to invite musicians into the studio to record. Some of these fortuitous, others intentional. From a whispering and hollering interview, Brian and I had an argument about how the bass lines worked on our old stuff, remembers Gaz. We both love Herbie Flowers' bass playing, so we paid him about £200 to come in and play. Another major change in the band's circumstances was the loss of Rob Manley, their A&R guy at Virgin. Replaced by someone referred to only as Brown Eye in the first ramblings of a Madman zine, not only did the group's relationship with the label begin to grow distant, but there was also little guidance given to the band themselves. Manley understood their music and, as part of his job, could give useful advice, guide them towards what was going to be the best way to complete an album, and help communicate this to the label. The new guy was considered a bit of a yes man, and thus was unable to really fill the hole Manley left. And thus the album's sessions went on and on and on, having tentatively begun in late 96, only coming to a close in 2001, 4.5 years later. In this time, around 70 musicians have been involved, from those they'd worked with before. At the start, Max Richter, who'd helped record instruments, as well as providing orchestration on several tracks and even co-producing some. Riz Maslan providing vocals, Richie Thomas, who was present at the start of the very early sessions while also preparing his still unreleased Big Mind Explosion album for EPV, to many friends who would form part of the Amorphous band over years to come, and a lot of one-off guest spots. Brian kept the whole thing afloat with his newfound expertise using Max, while, in his words, Garry has definitely guided this project. He has driven it and I've helped. When Garry was sick, I fucked around with computers. In 1999, several completed tracks were given to an unidentified friend from whom they leaked onto Last.fm many years later. These included a near-finished version of Elysian Fields, a couple of separate segments of the Galaxial Pharmaceutical, and early versions of the Isness, Theram and The World is Full of Plankton. Multiple mixes of the album were made, with many recurring tracks, but also several that would change from mix to mix. Snippets of news were given to Nick Woodfine's fan site via management, including a major change in direction and a first single, due around Christmas 1998, called Little Miss Divinity. After 1999, silence resumed, and eventually in 2001 the album was finished, named Galaxial Pharmaceutical and delivered to Virgin. The label's response was to drop them. Brown Eye was made redundant shortly afterwards. In defence of Virgin, after 5 years, and at this point that wasn't the usual gap between albums that it is today, an album at least partially unrecognisable as the same band was not the comeback thereafter. Even a more traditional FSOL album would have been a very difficult record to market in that post-Kid A musical landscape. The Orb's Sidonia received terrible reviews in 2001, with many complaining about how backwards looking and 90s it sounded. IDM was the word of the day, electronic music wise, and if an album didn't have some similarities with warp artists like Aphex Twin, Ortega or Square Pusher, it was likely to be considered a bit naff. Ironically, the Isness went on to receive far better reviews than most 90s acts of the time, even getting compared to Kid A in its blend of songs and electronics. Gaz was unsurprised at Virgin's decision. They told us we'd lose our fanbase if we came out with something like this, so we decided to part company. Amicably, of course. I suppose they were just playing it safe. Getafix's video interview after August's Big Chill DJ set features Gaz speaking very uncertainly about the band's future with the label, giving a rough time frame for when the decision was made. Shortly afterwards, the official site was updated to announce that a new Amorphous Androgynous album was coming. Intriguingly, the decision not to release it as an FSOL record came very late in the day, after much discussion in the band about whether this was really FSOL or not. Quite why the Amorphous name was chosen remains unknown, and it does seem like an odd choice. The previous Amorphous album, Tales of Ephedrina, was effectively FSOL in all but name, so surely a completely new name would have made more sense. That said, it, once again, ties in with the Dead Cities interviews, most notably the .talent article in which Gaz's final words were, "There may not be a future sound of London in a few years' time. It would be nice to be Amorphous Androgynous again." How prophetic is that? While record deals were being sorted, the band busied themselves with further projects. Gaz began to DJ on stage for the first time, new radio mixes were made and broadcast, the band's new direction was previewed on the Robert Miles remix and their own 10th anniversary reworkings of Papua New Guinea. New interviews gave a much shortened version of everything you've just heard. A promotional video called Psychedelic Manifesto previewed clips of Chihuahua, the Mellow Hippo Disco Show, and 2 tracks that would find their way onto later Amorphous albums. Eventually, a new record deal was signed with Artful and Fulfill, a Universal Records offshoot licensing music from artists' own sub-labels, in this case Future Sound of London Recordings. Ironically, Future Sound of London Recordings would never issue a Future Sound of London album. Thus, Brian and Gaz gained a significant amount of control over the release without losing the promotional benefits of major label backing. And then, things started to get really complicated. The news page from 2002 on my old Second Thought website gives some idea of the amount of rumours and confusion that circulated during the first half of the year as details of the album began to emerge. Channel 4's Planet Sound Teletext service were the first to announce the release date as 27th of May on the 10th of April 2002. That's really not long before the date. The album was mastered at Abbey Road in February, still under the name Galaxial Pharmaceutical. The final name change to the Isness must have been a very last minute decision. 5 days later, the official site declared the release date to be the 3rd of June. A couple of weeks later, online store CD Zone announced a pre-order to be shipped on the 27th of May. On the same day, an eBay auction appeared for the new album. I messaged the seller and she kindly sent over the tracklist, which had been altered from the version shared on the official site the previous year. A day later, Artful announced the release date had been put back to the 3rd of August. After a very nerve-wracking evening, I managed to win the auction for £65, a ludicrous amount of money for a 17-year-old in 2002, and waited for it to come in the post. In the meantime, the official website announced yet another release date, 29th of July, with the addition that the tracklist had yet to be finalised. An extensive interview came along in Music magazine, combined with a glowing review declaring the album to be worth a Spinal Tap-esque 6 out of 5, declaring it a beam of white light from heaven. It was then announced the album would come out in the US on August 13th through Hypnotic, who'd previously licensed their Jumpin' and Pumpin' releases for US distribution. I eventually received my eBay copy and listened to literally nothing else for a fortnight. I wrote a track-by-track review and put it on my site, along with a few 30-second clips with permission from the band, and a few weeks later the album leaked from a promo, and that's when things started getting even weirder. I've been working on this record for 5 years and there are about 20 different versions of it recorded. I loved that Incarnation Music reviewed, but it just had too much male energy, too much darkness. I wanted to get away from all that bullshit. The fact is I could carry on working on this album forever, but I had to stop somewhere. Gaz decided that the version of the album that had been already sent out as promos, and in the US already been manufactured as the main album, wasn't good enough. And so he and Brian went back to the studio and reworked it. So far, so odd, but Artful's following decision screwed things up big time. The new version was sent out as a promo, packaged in the old sleeve, meaning every single review of the album referenced incorrect titles. Some people on the FSOL list talked about hating Yes My Brother, and although I thought it a little pointless, I didn't really understand the hate until I downloaded the leak and realised that it was actually Divinity. Whoever reviewed the album for Pitchfork must have been keeping track, because almost every title in that review is actually correct. I still see copies of this version on file sharing services to this day. The next lot of promos that went out featured the correct tracklist printed and stuck inside the sleeve on a bit of plain paper, but it was too little too late. And not only did they change the running order and swap a couple of tracks, but many of the versions differ dramatically over the two versions of the album, most notably the radically different arrangements of the Mellow Hippo Disco Show and the Galaxial Pharmaceutical, but also subtly in the likes of Divinity and Go Tell It to the Trees Egghead. And then, when the final version came along, It turned out to be yet another mix of the album, different again from the second promo, with an added title track and a slightly shorter version of Mellow Hippo. Not content with releasing a musically confusing album, they also managed to boggle the mind with how it was released. And then Hypnotic refused to release it as Amorphous Androgynous in the US. Clearly only interested in making as much money from the FSOL name as possible, the label, having a license to the album, put it out with the future sound of London on the front and a press release not even hinting at the change in sound. To this day, some people are convinced it's an FSOL album rather than an Amorphous one because of this. Not feeling this was enough of a fuck up, they accidentally, and I hope you can hear the quotation marks there, put out the 2,500 copies of the earlier version they'd manufactured. These were officially recalled, although a lot made their way into stores and fan collections to the extent that it's possible to see this version referred to as the FSOL mix and the final one as the Amorphous version, due to this only happening in the US. The early version was mostly widely known as the mist-pressed version, although the official name is the Abbey Road version, and that's generally how it gets referred these days. Throw in the spelling mistakes, her tongue is Loke, a jellyfish, and engineered by Gage, and the whole US release was an absolute mess. It is of no surprise that the band have never worked with Hypnotic since. When the label attempted to reissue the album in its Abbey Road format in 2012, just before the 10-year license was up, and that was probably them just trying to sell off their remaining copies, it was stopped after the band found out. And just when things couldn't get any more baffling, a 2LP version came along a while later with a track list shifted around to fit the format, and an additional track not on the CD version entitled Chihuahua, the instrumental first heard on the Psychedelic Manifesto video the previous year. A promo CDR then circulated the UK featuring an exclusive edit of Divinity. In 2004, almost all of the extant material finally found its way together in a 2-CD package called the Isness and the Otherness. Years later, Gaz admitted on Facebook that he agrees with the general fan consensus and the Abbey Road version is the superior of the two, and regrets changing the album, with the loud mastering from Abbey Road being the main culprit behind the supposed masculine energy on that version. That version eventually received a belated vinyl release for Record Store Day 2018. Inevitably, it turned out to be another alternative mix. This version is present on the Amorphous Bandcamp page, even though buying the CD from there will give you that as a download, but the final mix on the CD. And what of the music itself? Despite the obvious major differences, a lot of it is still very FSOL in places. First of all, it's ludicrously varied. I've often described it as sounding like a psychedelic compilation as much as the work of a single artist, containing everything from breakbeat and sound collage to Indian classical music, country, psychedelic pop, progressive rock, acoustic balladry and instrumental funk. There are 5 songs, with the rest being instrumental, which is somewhat at odds with how the project began. Many of the instrumentals really aren't that far off sounding like FSOL, especially the likes of Elysian Fields and Her Tongue is Like the Jellyfish. To be honest, if it was me who was deciding how the album was released, I would have actually knocked together an LP of all the instrumental pieces and delivered that to Virgin, with the album of songs as an Amorphous record to be a side project. They could well have kept their Virgin contract at that point. The songs themselves are the biggest changes, quite obviously, especially Divinity, which is a world away from anything they'd released before. Production-wise, the album is thick and dense like FSOL, with many tracks being largely loop-based. Several, particularly those from early in the sessions, feature samples. Live drums and 60s recordings were chopped up to make into breakbeats. Despite the big ostentatious sound, it's maybe slightly more lo-fi than one might expect from FSOL. The sessions were a learning curve, and FSOL being FSOL, they took a very DIY approach, discovering how to record and mix sounds and instruments as they went along. Other than the songs, the biggest difference from the band's 90s work is the complete lack of environments and siegs. Other than the 2002 Abbey Road cut featuring a subtle crossfade between the Mellow Hippo Disco Show and Goodbye Sky Reprise, no tracks are joined in any way. This makes it feel more like a traditional rock album, very un-FSOL-ish, probably more than any other aspect in the album. Reception was mixed. The press response was largely very positive, with many reviews praising the album's boldness, its scope, its production and its humour. Some, however, felt it was a poor retread of the past and at odds with what listeners would want from a previously forward-looking band. Fan response led to some very interesting and very angry arguments at the time, with a lot of people loathing the album. Many were those who hadn't followed the minutiae of the band's returns, simply expecting another FSOL record. Unsurprisingly, many of these were severely disappointed. The group's flirtation with more psychedelic imagery, even in the 90s, meant they've always had enough of a fan base with the right taste for the album to ensure many were delighted. Similarly, they also have a sizable fan base within the IDM world who were largely appalled by the Isness. Despite the odds, first week sales were strong enough for the album to reach 68 in the UK Top 100. It would be their last charting album, however, with many fans feeling let down. Artful's decision to put the Future Sound of London Present stickers on the cover meant that, despite the band trying their best to promote the new project correctly, the album was still listed as an FSOL album called Amorphous Androgynous Isness on most online stores and placed in the dance music section of record shops. Inevitably, the corporate machine destroyed the opportunity for the record to be received as it was intended, as a new musical project rather than a new FSOL album. Combined with the US release's complete misnaming, it was effectively career suicide, no matter how much they might have argued that it wasn't the new FSOL album. Even on the FSOL list, which had been sharing and discussing the 7 psychedelic DJ mixes bootlegged to that point, the Robert Miles remix, Papua New Guinea translations, the various pages on the official site with clips of the album and text about the radical change in style and interviews about the new approach, one regular poster expressed disappointment as he had been expecting the album to sound like Dead Cities. Tough crowd. Thankfully, enough fans enjoyed the album to stick with the band, with many picking and choosing their favourite moments, and others, myself including, believing the album to be absolutely fantastic, the Abbey Road version at least in my case. And not only did the press mostly appreciate the record, but radio DJs were similarly impressed, and the band were afforded the opportunity to promote the album with a mix of Amorphous material, followed by a continuation of their monstrous psychedelic bubble DJ mixes. Within a year, live DJ shows picked up again, with added instrumentation, and Amorphous Androgynous appearing on the bill, if sometimes still with FSOL alongside. Artwork-wise, the Isness is probably a bigger departure than the music itself. The front cover, depicting pinhole photos of a naked woman, Katie, comes from photographer Jim Cherry, and it's not the least FSOL-like image around, particularly given that she looks dead. The rest of the booklet is a different affair. Largely collaged by Gaz, it features a large number of photographs of the band, Katie, flowers, the various musicians on the record, and the Galaxial Pharmaceutical Studio, mostly warped, layered and digitally shaded in a manner which could be described as either charmingly slapdash or amateurish depending on your particular stance. There's none of the landscape photography of the 90s and of course no Vit, Shonin or Spiky. Boogie is nowhere to be found at all. 2 pages of psychedelic gobbledygook, or liner notes as they've been called, by Donovan open the booklet, and a similar spread of thanks can be found at the end. Each track gets its own page in the book, with lyrics where applicable, and swathes of credits. A day out to a house with large animal sculptures outside forms a lot of the photography, taken by Brian using his newfound interest in pinhole photography. These co-star musician Park, who is due to release an album on FSOL Digital some point this century. In suitably whimsical fashion, Gaz is holding a double bass and Brian a tuba. For the US release, 4 additional pages are added, as well as the spelling mistakes. The mispress release, however, comes with an 8-page booklet with no photography, merely lyrics and credits. The earlier cover, present on both the mispress CD and promo versions, features an altered version of the Katie image, flipped, squashed and with more of an orangey tint. The Isness was the band's first release not to just come in a jewel case. The initial UK pressing came in a Burgo pack, effectively 2 trays in a cardboard slipcase. Pulling one tray out pushes the other out the other side, which is quite a fun novelty, before a standard jewel case version followed, the US mispress version being a rare example of an FSOL digipack release. Keen to include all the photography and artwork, the decision was even made to include the CD booklet inside the gatefold vinyl sleeve. The fonts are all generally cursive, once again no sign of the typical FSOL Euro-style extended or anything similar, and occasionally quite garish. No need to mention it really, but the EBV logo is of course absent. And I think that's about it, apart from the track by track. The Lovers. So here's an oddity, a track released as both FSOL and Amorphous. Properly so. Originally appearing as a 9-minute track on Papua New Guinea translations, a much more suitable 6-minute edit made it to the final cut of the Isness the following year. is a very different edit, the first 2 minutes the same, but then moving much more swiftly into the guitar solo section at around 5 minutes, which to be fair is where a lot of the track's interest lies. This is effectively the ultimate version of the track, so much so that it even appeared on the 2006 Best Of compilation Teachings from the Electronic Brain, albeit with a very slightly quicker fade out. The Isness. Originally titled Low Tide on the Sea of Flesh, the Isness is a mellow, almost ambient track that would feel as much at home on an FSOL album as an Amorphous one. An organ and synth flute plays throughout, while Baluji Srivastav's sitar is chopped, reassembled and looped. Starting in a major key, the Cabbage Orchestra's dramatic strings move the mood into darker territory. An organ solo plays in the second half, and the track is completed with some seashore field recordings. It's a brief, unassuming piece that maybe gets a little forgotten in context of the whole album. Upon re-listening to the track for this review, I realised just how beautiful it is, especially the strings, and I've decided to make an effort to listen to it more in the future. As the only track completely unique to the final mix of the album, a version which I rarely listen to, it's always been a bit off my radar. The Mellow Hippo Disco Show. The track with the most startling difference in arrangement between the two versions of the Isness, the Mellow Hippo Disco Show, is the band's first psychedelic pop song. It began life as a very different work, the breakbeat-led Trying to Make Impermanent Things Permanent, first heard on the 1997 John Peel session and also played on other 1997 transmissions. A brief clip of an alternate mix later appeared on the Psychedelic Manifesto video in 2001. The incredible looking credits suggesting that the outro strings were recorded in July 1996, only a few weeks after the completion of the Dead Cities material, turned out to be false. Undoubtedly a typing mistake, with them recorded either 97 or 98. The final version opens with a growling synth and slabs of organ chords, in a more heavily proggy sounding version than the Abbey Road mix. Clattering drums and mellotron lines come in before Gaz starts singing. This is the point where a lot of fans began to wonder what on earth they were listening to. I found my own source for lyrics in a biography written by Albert Goldman about John Lennon, and I wanted to thank and highlight other true and great visionaries who've inspired me over the years. The track itself is one small element to a larger picture. What this actually means is a load of nonsense lyrics that all rhyme with Mellow Hippo Disco Show. She's hiding from the yo-yo, it's a real no-no, life with Jojo, etc, etc. It's mostly enjoyable whimsy, although slow-mo on the dildo and mumbo-jumbo slow fellatio move it into slightly questionable territory. After the verses, the vocals move into some very silly la-la-las, and the titular vocals from Trying to Make Impermanent Things Permanent, before building up with choirs, brass and strings to the utterly ridiculous chorus. After a breakdown into birdsong, the string outro comes in, and the final moments reprise the end of Trying to Make Impermanent Things Permanent itself. It's quite a sinister sounding song, with the whimsy of the lyrics meshing well with the darker chords. The final version's bigger arrangement moves it away from the Beatlesy 60s pop of the Abbey Road version. It spawned a huge number of rearrangements, many of them on the multi-part single released later in 2002, and further mixes appearing on the band's MySpace and in 2008 on the Peppermint Tree as Yantra. The mid-2002 mislabeled promo version is slightly longer than the final album mix, featuring an additional 8 bars in the middle. Mikey Rowe gets a co-writing credit, the track is built around his mellotron line, and other musicians getting their first credit of many include Dan Pemberton, Chris Marjorie and Morven Bryce. Goodbye Sky Reprise. Little more than a brief song interlude, Goodbye Sky Reprise has nothing to do with the original Goodbye Sky, other than the inclusions of the words Goodbye Sky of course, but it is a composition in its own right, recorded at Richie Thomas's studio, Thomas providing Rhodes piano. He spoke of working on the album in 1997, meaning this could be one of the earliest pieces recorded for the record. It's undoubtedly one of the earliest of the actual songs. Subtle backing vocals by Jocelyn Donlevy add a prettiness to the track. It's a lovely little piece that should have been longer. On the 2002 mispress version, the track is cross-faded with the previous track, making it the only time on the Isness tracks aren't joined by silence. Elysian Fields. One of the tracks that changed dramatically between the two different cuts of the Isness, the two versions are actually in totally different keys and feature different rhythm tracks. The final album version has a gently rolling breakbeat, making it the mellower of the two. Opening on organ chords, the piece builds to include strings, flute and a guitar solo from Garry Lucas. With various sounds coming and going throughout the track, often in the background, it's one of the most FSOL-esque pieces on the album, and it's no surprise that it was a comparatively early piece recorded for the record. Indeed, it started life at Earthbeat, and this version was completed by 1999. A breakdown in the middle features chopped up breaks and deeper bass, plunging the track further into more obvious electronica territory. Samples of diff jaws and gong are credited in the liner notes, suggesting again it was recorded before the move from sampling to original composition. Max Richter is credited for outro strings. His work with the group was once again early on and included orchestration in recording. In Gaz's words, we went round to Max's where he developed all these high-end orchestra samples that we orchestrated up into full parts. The track, along with the 1997 sessions, gives an idea of what a psychedelic FSOL record might have sounded like. The breakbeat closely resembles the Beatles' Tomorrow Never Knows and the Chemical Brothers' Private Psychedelic Reel, two tracks often played alongside each other on various FSOL DJ sets, the latter of which Gaz was particularly inspired by, telling Remix magazine, "When I heard it, I heard a track that was made exactly like we made Dead Cities. The only difference was the nature of the sounds." Go Tell It to the Trees, Egghead. I did not like this track on first hearing it. There I was, expecting an album of electronic tinged psych pop and prog rock, and along comes this thing that sounds like country music. It's grown on me a lot over the years though, and I absolutely love it now. It's completely daft and almost childlike innocence throughout, the track chopping and changing between Indian classical instrumentation, country slide guitar and harmonica, an off-key glockenspiel, fuzzy rock guitar, parping trumpets, French-sounding accordion and mellow synths. It's a really varied track and incredibly spacious, with every instrument having loads of room to breathe, even when plenty are playing at once. At 2 minutes 46, the two different versions on the two mixes of the album diverge a little. The final mix cuts an entire minute, moving straight to the end of the track. It's one of the least dramatic alterations on the record, with both versions working well enough. It's nice to have an extra minute, but at 4 minutes 28 the final version is a decent length too. It makes you wonder just how many subtly alternate versions of these tracks exist in the vaults. The piece's working title was Hick. In 2003 it was licensed to mobile phone provider Orange for use in one of their TV adverts. Divinity. In 1999, Freedom Management mentioned to Nick Woodfine for his website that a new single was ready to go called Little Miss Divinity. In hindsight, maybe alarm bells should have started ringing with that title, but then again FSOL have always gone with odd track names. This would have really come out of the blue if it had been the lead single. By far the least FSOL sounding track on the Isness, Divinity is an 8-minute acoustic ballad. Imagine that being their next release after We Have Explosive. Opening with a tin whistle, the track moves into warm major key guitar chords, over the top of which the assembled band improvise for a few minutes. Then the big arrangement breaks down either into piano chords on the final mix or a guitar solo on the Abbey Road version. And then Gaz starts singing. This is maybe the second point on the album where some fans decided to get off the train. It's a bit of a love-hate song, and I've heard some absolute vitriol aimed at it, song of pain being one amusing description. Gaz's vocals come in for a bit of stick at times, but I'm generally fond of them from this era. Not here, however, his slightly nasal delivery does nothing positive for me at all, and I generally stick to the 2003-2004 versions with the new vocal take. That said, many people absolutely adore this version. Not bringing drums in until well over halfway through is a brave move. The lyrics are about self-love. Little Miss Divinity, you're the one that you've been looking for, being content through accepting who you are despite any limitations you may perceive in yourself. It's a wonderful message and conveyed pretty well. I do think you have time, you're doing fine is an absolutely lovely refrain. The melody is gorgeous, the production and arrangement are stunning, the reverb on the hand claps, the brilliant placing of the pizzicato strings in the mix. It's a great pairing of Gaz's song and Brian's engineering and mixing. The final mix does have a very slightly jarring moment at 6 minutes 27 where 8 bars are cut, and anyone familiar enough with the Abbey Road version will spot the moment two different sitar melodies are stuck together. It sticks out like a sore thumb for me. For that reason alone I prefer the Abbey Road version. When the Abbey Road version received an official release in 2018, Divinity was renamed to Little Miss Divinity, with a different vocal arrangement over the outro section because, well, that's the sort of thing they do. A version was recorded with Donovan on vocals and bizarrely remains unreleased.
Little Miss Divinity, won't you lay your life on me?
Guru Song. Opening with reverse sounds and field recordings, Guru Song moves the Isness slightly back towards FSOL territory once more, especially once the clattering breaks come in, overlaid with numerous samples. That's right, this is another Earthbeat era track. Sitar notes and guitar chords are among those samples, but overall it's a fairly electronic sounding piece. The Abbey Road version includes Anjali Saga singing "The ego does not go where there is nothing to gain, the ego does not know life without pain" as the song element of Guru Song. The final mix of the album cuts this vocal part, and some cut up strings afterwards, for a phased instrumental section, despite including the lyrics in the booklet still. Live versions, however, include the vocals. A guitar solo comes in at the end, giving a slightly more Amorphous-y feel. The piece started life as The Peppermint Tree, a more traditional psychedelic pop song which ended up discarded or lost somehow. The two share guitar, sitar and birdsong sounds. The sped up piano outro appears to have been around for some time, originally appearing at the end of Theram. I think Guru Song has always been my least favourite track on the Isness for some reason. It's perfectly fine, but I just don't really get much from it at all. It's just kind of there. Possibly in context of a more breakbeaty FSOL style record, it might sit a bit better with me. Osho, a piece of Indian classical inspired music built around a Baluji sitar melody, guitar chords, strings and wordless vocals. Although largely sedate in sound, there's a subtle unease running behind things. It was quite possibly an early recording for the album, both in terms of Riz Maslan providing vocals and the use of samples, including flute from an actual Indian piece. Ocean waves add to the gentle, relaxing feel. For the 2018 Abbey Road reissue, an extended cut was used, adding almost a minute to the track. Her tongue is like a jellyfish. Opening with a dramatic string arrangement scored and recorded by Max Richter, the bizarrely named Her Tongue is Like a Jellyfish quickly changes direction into a bizarre array of samples and noises. Gaz's description to Remix Magazine is an excellent summary. On that particular track, originally called FX Warp's Sampler Spew, Brian was trying to write a track and it spat this shit back at him. The sampler jammed, spewing the samples out left and right, constantly morphing into each other. It seemed to join at the end of the sample with the entire contents of the Akai S3000 sampler. It's an incredibly hidden gate that spews out the most incredible shit. It is magic. Whether it's the fact that it started out as a Brian piece, the presence of samples, or just the general weirdness, but Her Tongue is Like a Jellyfish is the most overtly FSOL track on the whole of the Isness. Flute, dramatic strings, odd noises, twangy guitars, wobbly synths, tinny percussion, electric piano, backwards sitars, and an unsettlingly easy listening outro all follow each other in quick succession. It's utterly bonkers and totally brilliant, and I love the fact that, despite the huge number of more intricately written, recorded and mixed tracks being made during these sessions, they kept this strange little accident on every version of the album. For reasons beyond my comprehension, Max Richter's opening strings are not present on the 2018 Abbey Road version of the album. Meadows. Meadows is a bit of a backwards looking track career-wise in that it directly references two FSOL works. The opening monologue is newly recorded but may be best known to FSOL fans in its original version sampled from the movie Silent Running, often played during the 1993 Kiss FM transmissions and 94 3D Headspace tour. The other moment is at 2 minutes 17, the girl crying in Hyde Park from the end of Glass. It's a moment that always gives me chills. The track is a very mellow, pastoral piece with slide guitar, an acoustic bass riff, banjo and strings. There's an almost tropical feel to it, as if lying on a beach, and it bears more than a little influence from Fleetwood Mac's Albatross. Probably Max Richter's biggest contribution to the album, he provides much of the instrumentation and is given co-writing and co-production credits, with the piece largely being recorded at his own studio in the late 90s. In many ways it sums up the big difference between FSOL and Amorphous beyond the obvious songs and things. This is an instrumental piece largely based around samples, recorded and mixed in an electronic style, and yet it's very simple, it's very easy, it's kind of chill out room friendly, and it doesn't contain any of the weirdness of FSOL at all. For the 2018 Abbey Road version, elements of The Season's Turn are placed over the ending, hinting that the track may have been Seasons from the scrapped 2001 edition mentioned on the official site. In late 2001, there was a rumour of a CD promo of Meadows being released, although no sign has appeared since. I Died on the Sea of Flesh. The only track to remain identical over every edition of the Isness, I Died on the Sea of Flesh is a dark piece with a suitably disturbing name. Moving back towards the Indian classical end of things, I Died is built around a phased guitar loop, sampled percussion, finger-picked acoustic guitar, sitar and strings, With its nocturnal atmosphere, background samples and electronics, and looped acoustics, it's the closest to ambient the album comes, and unsurprisingly has become one of the tracks more favoured by FSOL fans less keen on the Amorphous approach. Indeed, it wouldn't be dramatically out of place on Lifeforms or ISDN, with slightly less overt sitar soloing at least. Certainly its construction was like that of an FSOL track. It sounds like a band, but every performance is sampled and then slightly skewed. We've kept the energy of the live performances, but given it that otherworldly edge, Gaz told Future Music. A beautiful atmospheric piece and a real highlight of the album. It has a semi-official partner track, the Isness, which had the working title of Low Tide on the Sea of Flesh. The Galaxial Pharmaceutical. This here is the main reason I rarely listen to the final mix of the Isness. Of all the differences between the two, most are largely superficial, with even the alternate takes of Mellow Hippo and Elysian Fields being of similar enough quality to enjoy both. But no, I can't be having this. The Galaxial Pharmaceutical was written as a prog epic, and the Abbey Road version's structure is magnificent. It starts with 4-minute ambient section, washes of synth, strings, acoustic guitar, electric guitar, field recordings, all utterly glorious. After some dramatic chords, a piano starts and Gaz's main song comes in. Written during his time with a broken ankle, it started out as a parody of Bowie's Space Oddity by looking inwards instead of outwards, and took on the epic feel once he started really exploring the idea of oneself and connections within the universe, inspired by the writings of Deepak Chopra. Layers of synths are gradually added to the track until eventually drums come in. It's all very big and dramatic. Some Space Oddity homage chords change things, and it moves into a rock section complete with dramatic strings. Another big change, and 2 minutes of a separate song, Am I Big or Am I Small, a bizarre whimsical psychedelic pop song written early in the sessions, come in before resolving into a huge climax at the end. The original chords return, Gaz ponders whether he'll return to the real world, drums come in, a sax solo reaches crescendo, drums are filtered into huge clangs, and it all dissolves into washes of noise, helicopters and answering machines until silence hits. The ebbs and flows, the build to the final crescendo, it's the perfect example of how to do this kind of epic. And then they went and chopped it in half. The final mix throws in the final sax solo section just before the 7-minute mark and then fades to silence. Then various sound effects fade in, the track comes back with the rock section, plays through to near the end, and then stops abruptly without any climax. Admittedly, the ending of a phone ringing and someone saying pick up, pick up, pick up is a very good way to do an abrupt ending, but I cannot fathom how it was decided that this was a better way to do it than the Abbey Road version. And while I generally try to see the band's perspective and offer gentle criticism, you can hear the join at 6 minutes 48. The two sections have totally different mixes, different levels of bass, different drum sounds. It's the only time in their entire catalogue where I think I could probably have done this better. And you'd think that adding a 2-minute gap in the middle of the track would increase the length of the piece in general, but so many bits are chopped out that it still ends up being 30 seconds shorter than the Abbey Road version. Anyway, now that's off my chest. The Abbey Road version is my second favourite track by Brian and Gaz, behind My Kingdom Part 1. I clearly love the epics. I love everything about it. It's a great chord sequence with an excellent melody, the rock section is suitably dramatic, Am I Big or Am I Small, with its easy listening loops and oddly filtered vocals, is magnificently strange, although it's a huge shame the whole track was lost, and is only known through the Last FM leak of 6 1999 tracks. The opening ambience, also a 1999 track called Galaxial Prologue, is incredibly beautiful, and the build-up to that climax at the end still gives me shivers. If you are going to do maximalist music, throw absolutely everything at it like this. It's an incredible feat of production for something recorded in the late 90s, and pushed the band and their gear to their limits. The full thing took well over a year to record, Gaz describing the process to Disquiet as multi-tracking, recording down into 2 tracks, overdubbing, losing the originals. Some of the versions could have been better, but we lost a lot of the constituent parts over the years. We moved studio, we lost discs. I reckon there are at least 128 different tracks of audio over the whole thing, which led to Macs crashing and headaches being caused. I must have listened to this piece 100 times in the first couple of weeks of owning the album, and now, nearly 20 years later, it still gives me goosebumps. It's an absolute masterpiece. No doubt it's my love for this version that leads me to dislike the fractured final mix so much. In 2018, the final official Abbey Road version came out, including the track in full, minus the I Love You outro, a cut I fully endorse as that section is really silly. The track samples Peter Howell's Through a Glass Darkly, a lyrical adventure, and Max Richter's arrangements and orchestrations are important enough to get him a co-writing credit. The track is the only one to feature both Richter and Dan Pemberton, the latter would later take over Richter's role as the band's piano and strings guy. The title went on to become the name of the band's Old Street studio from 1998 to 2005 and was intended to be the title of the album, minus the different article, being changed to the Isness at the last minute. The 2018 Abbey Road version reinstates the title as simply Galaxial Pharmaceutical.
Pick up.
Chihuahua. Named as a pun to the type of guitar pedal and originally an unadvertised exclusive track on the 2LP version of the Isness, Chihuahua eventually found a proper home on the Otherness 2 years later. By far the rockiest track released at the time, it's another early piece, elements first appearing on the Fun Radio 97 transmission, with guitar and bass added by Richie Thomas, a friend and regular collaborator at that point in their career. The bouncy, guitar-led track feels more like an instrumental B-side from a Britpop band than anything Brian and Gaz released as FSOL though, although the sample drum loop betrays the track's electronic origins. It's a catchy piece, although a bit lightweight. Nevertheless, I was very happy to hear it on the vinyl edition of the album, as I've been so disappointed by how little of the psychedelic manifesto video had made it onto the CD version of the album. This is the track that opened that video. The occasionally near unreadable font on the back cover of the Otherness often led to websites such as allmusic.com calling the track Chanvanvar. Elysian Fields, Abbey Road version. I don't know which version of Elysian Fields I prefer. The Abbey Road version is louder, punchier, has a breakbeat much higher in the mix and even a faster tempo, all making it much more energetic and exciting. But the arrangement is a bit more stop-start than the final mix and lacks the wonderful cut-up breaks in the second half. The actual arrangements of the tracks are very different, with plenty of work being done on the piece over the years. After the initial Abbey Road cut was scrapped, this mix turned up on the Otherness and formed the basis of live versions over the years, eventually being fully reinstated on the Abbey Road version of the album in 2018. Personally, I find its punchy nature is a much better kickstart to the album than The Lovers. Future Music magazine ran a remix competition for Elysian Fields in 2002, with samples and loops from the Abbey Road version being given away with the magazine. The magazine picked their favourites for the band to choose a winner from, and nothing was ever heard again. The Mellow Hippo Disco Show Abbey Road version, also known as Life's a Flow and Yo-Yo Abbey Road version. The version of the Mellow Hippo Disco Show first heard on the Psychedelic Manifesto video, at least roughly. The Abbey Road version is generally considered the best version, aligning much closer with the Beatlesy 60s psychedelic pop sound the band were often referencing. Softer drums and fewer layers of organ remove the proggy feel of the final mix of the song, and the shorter runtime make it more easily approachable. Opening with the Mellotron line and guitar samples from Trying to Make Impermanent Things Permanent, the track feels much closer to that 1997 track than the final mix does. The middle section even features Mikey Rowe's full organ solo rather than the slightly more aimless meandering of the midsection on the final mix. The utter madness that follows the chorus is also marvellous, a cacophony of noise that sounds like a brass band speeding up into infinity, followed by car horns, an orchestral warm-up and the opening guitar riff once more. Despite its more overtly poppy feel, the inclusion of large chunks of Trying to Make Impermanent Things make the track feel much more FSOL-ish than the rockier final version. The mix has appeared numerous times since the 2002 Abbey Road version of the album was scrapped, first as the closing part of the Mellow Hippo Disco Show single, bringing this suite to a fitting climax, later in 2004 on the Otherness as Yo-Yo Abbey Road version for reasons, and finally on the 28 Abbey Road version of the Isness, although then minus the final string reprise. Again, finding a definitive version of anything from this era is next to impossible. Divinity Album Edit. Originally released on the Isness Sampler CDR promo in early 2002, this edit eventually found wider release and a confirmed title on the Divinity promo single. specifically an edit of the Abbey Road version of the original. It's effectively the middle main section of the song, with a few of the Hey Now sections removed before the If You Need lyrics. With the song originally announced as Little Miss Divinity to be the lead single from the Isness in '99, it's likely that, had that plan gone ahead, it would have sounded something like this on the single. Only a couple of years after We Have Explosive, it's fair to say this would have been an even bigger surprise than what we got in the end. Just imagine the fan reactions. And on that note, you've probably had about as much Isness as you can take for one day. We have reached the end of the video. Thank you for sticking with me this long. I would love to hear your thoughts down below. This is just one of those defining moments for the band. The point where half their fan base decided that they really weren't interested in anymore. Just a bizarre fan base killing album. I would love to hear your thoughts. Did you love it? Did you hate it? Are you one of those many people who like bits of it? Has your opinion changed over the years? Leave me a comment down below. You know where the comment section is now. There are also like, subscribe, share buttons which you can also press, and as always, any kind of interaction really helps my channel. So thank you for the support, and next time I'll be looking at what happens straight after the Isness with some promotional shows and the Mellow Hippo single, so I really hope you join me then.